NOTUS is a podcast from NOTUS, hosted by Reese Gorman and presented by BP.
It's so rare that a president does not endorse an incumbent of their own party for a seat that will really matter to keep the majority in a chamber.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to On Notice. I'm your host, Reese Gorman. This is a special Texas-themed edition of the pod where I will talk to three of the smartest people we know about Texas. Daniella Diaz, my colleague who is a Texas native, such as myself, who was recently in the state covering the race. My other colleague, Roarty, who covers campaigns and elections for us here at NOTUS. And Patrick Svitek, who spent more than a decade covering Texas politics and who's had quite the career covering it too since before moving out to DC. The timing couldn't be better because, as you probably know, the Texas Senate primary is this week and the races are hotly contested in both the Democratic primary and the Republican primary. On the Democratic side, we got James Talarico, a member of the state legislature. He was seen as a clear frontrunner until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered the race after we exclusively reported that national Republicans had propped up her campaign to make her believe that she had a chance of beating Talarico. On the Republican side, we have sitting Senator John Cornyn, who is the establishment favorite, but he is fending off quite the challenge in Attorney General Ken Paxton, who is safe to say has a few skeletons in his closet, and Congressman Wesley Hunt, who started as what looks like the underdog, but has been surging here lately. Come join the discussion with us. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Behind the delivery trucks that keep your life stocked, thousands of employees at BP go to work every day. People bringing a new offshore production platform online. People making our refineries capable of more, like making renewable diesel from agricultural waste. People trading and shipping fuels to our customers. And people helping truckers fill up and get maintenance at our convenient locations. They're part of almost 300,000 jobs we support across the country. Just a few of the ways BP is investing in America.
Welcome back to On Notice. Let's start on the Democratic side of the aisle here in the Texas primaries. NOTUS was the first to report that the Republican Senate campaign arm was astroturfing in this race, hoping to get Jasmine Crockett to jump in, and she ultimately did, and they believe that she will be the easiest opponent to beat as opposed to James Talarico. What do you make of that strategy, Alex?
I think that they can be pretty happy with themselves right now because Jasmine Crockett looks like she still has a real chance to win the primary. And I think most Republicans, when you talk to them privately or sometimes even publicly, they think that she's going to be the weaker general election opponent of the two between her and James Talarico. So they've had a lot of success with it. You know, I think it's been interesting, Reese. I actually feel like some of your reporting has shown up in the primary between Talarico and Crockett. Some Democrats have been pointing out that, look, Republicans wanted her in the race. We shouldn't acquiesce to what they want, you know, and it really goes to this larger issue, which I think that a lot of the primary has been about. It's been about electability. Of course, Texas Democrats, it's been several decades since they won a statewide race in Texas. And so when they're, I think, even rank and file voters evaluate, you know, which candidate they're going to pick in the primary, I don't necessarily know if they're picking their values or they're picking just a candidate they think can win, right? And so we've seen it kind of play into this larger argument. But look, I think the question is, you know, they've been successful thus far, but it still remains to be seen if Crockett can get through the primary. Right now, it does seem like a kind of a toss-up race.
Patrick, what says you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans in Texas are especially enticed by Crockett as the nominee, given the comments she had in the last year or so about Hispanic voters of Trump. I mean, that is, I think, in their, opposition research playbook, that is what excites them the most potentially about running against her in a general election in Texas. Texas Republicans have been working so hard in the past several years to make inroads with Hispanic voters in Texas. And now you have Trump's standing dropping with Hispanic voters. And so this, having someone like Crockett as the nominee would be, an opportunity to maybe try to halt that reversal of growing support among Hispanic voters in Texas.
Alex, you wrote a great piece on Crockett's non-traditional campaign, including the fact that it's unclear if she has a campaign manager right now. She doesn't really seem to have much TV ads at the time. I know since then she has put at least one up on TV. it kind of is similar to her reputation up here on the Hill, and that's one reason why she flamed out of the race for the ranking Democrat in the Oversight Committee. People just feel like she didn't necessarily take the job seriously, was too flashy and fiery. And can you just talk about the reporting for a little bit?
Yeah, I think, in talking with people who were talking with Crockett's campaign, there was some confusion really about who was running it and why they weren't seeing more of a traditional campaign. And we can talk about, door knocking efforts and ground game and making sure that you visit, and campaign across the state. The biggest concern, bar none, was that she wasn't running TV ads at the time and that she was being badly outspent by Tallarico and Tallarico Super PAC. Now, since then, she has started to spend some money. But, I checked, the ad tracking service we have here at NOTUS just before coming on. Tallarico is still outspending her 4-1 as of today, in ads. That's a gigantic difference. And I think it does go to one of the concerns Democrats have about her campaign in a general election. Patrick mentioned some of the comments she's made about Hispanic voters. That's absolutely at the top of the list. I think next to that is a concern that she won't run a traditional campaign, that she won't run a campaign that uses a lot of TV ads, that uses strategies and tactics that have proven to be effective over the years, that she's going to be willing and her team are going to be willing to take advice and listen to guidance from Democrats in Washington and others. And I think there is a real concern about that. I mean, remember, look, Texas is a nation state, right? It is a gigantic state where you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars really just to get your message out in a general election. Thus far, Jasmine Crockett's campaign in the primary has spent $3 million. Again, according to our ad tracking service, that's not a lot of money. And I think there's a real concern that strategy would be replicated to some degree, even in a general election.
Danielle, I want to come to you about Crockett seems to be the front runner. She seems to be kind of out in the lead. But Tallarico has really he's had a lot of steam, has a lot of kind of the swell support specifically. What does this race kind of say about the Democratic Party? And also, where do you think, if Tallarico is to come and beat Crockett, where would his support and kind of this groundswell come from?
It's interesting. I was just on the phone with a political strategist in Texas, not even, 20 minutes ago, who continues to see what's happening in Texas as a coin toss. But it's also interesting to me because, as you guys have mentioned, there is a complete difference in how the two of them are running their campaign. I mean, Tallarico has millions of dollars backing him. He has a very structured operation on the ground in Texas. And then we have Jasmine Crockett, who's truly running on mostly name ID. She has a lot of viral moments. She has the grassroots operation of Black voters in Texas that support her. So it's unclear right now who could potentially win on Tuesday. It truly is a coin toss. But I went to a Tallarico event on Tuesday, Reese, on Tuesday evening, and it was an interesting contrast to what I had gathered from what Jasmine Crockett was doing in Texas with smaller gatherings, with a lot of free-for-all conversations that she was having with voters. Tallarico had a message. He had a very anti-billionaire, helping the working class message in Texas. That's his stump speech. And he had hundreds of people in the room. What I found most interesting about this is that it was in a very Hispanic neighborhood in Austin, but I did not talk to a lot of Hispanic voters or Black voters in the room. I would say it was a lot of educated white voters in the room during this event in Austin on Tuesday. I think that sums up what we're seeing take place in Texas right now. Jasmine Crockett is making a play at Hispanic voters to Black voters in the state. Tallarico, of course, is trying, but he has a lot of popularity among white voters in the state. Unclear right now who could possibly turn out on Tuesday in the past 2 weeks in early voting and who's going to come out on top. I mean, either of them could take it at this point.
I mean, I'm a native Texan such as yourself. I've been talking, I'm sure you have, to a bunch of family members about this election. And I have some family members who have voted Republican their entire life. And this religious message that Tallarico is bringing really is incentivizing to them and makes them really like him. And he's kind of won over some of them just because of this religious message that they're looking to be like, oh, like religion's such a deeply held belief and issue for me when voting, that they're looking at like, okay, well, if this guy's talking about it more than the other three Republican candidates are, and I'm going to vote for him. How important is this religious issue becoming in Texas in the race?
I'm from the Rio Grande Valley. And I can tell you that basically every person I talk to, my family, anyone in that area, it's more than 1 million people in South Texas, are religious. They're predominantly Catholic. That message speaks to a lot of minority voters in the state. And look, if someone wants to win the Democratic primary, they're probably going to need that electorate. It is incredibly interesting to hear Tallarico talk about religion, Reese, in the way that he does, because it seems that that tends to be something Democrats don't talk about on the stage. He is a pastor. He is very religious, and it's something that he talks about pretty widely in all of his speeches. And it's something that can resonate with that electorate in Texas that cares about those issues. Now, is that the only thing that's going to help him in Texas? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of factors playing into this. We have not really discussed pocketbook issues that are affecting Texans that they care about, that these Democrats are really trying to campaign on. I mean, when I listened to Tallarico, that's all he was talking about, was trying to help Americans, Texans specifically, with the economy. That's what he would do if he were in the Senate. Jasmine Crockett's message is more varied, and she's also running on what she's done in Congress already. That's what we've heard her really stick to. I mean, even last week, she took a break from the campaign trail to go to Ohio and do a deposition with Les Wexner for the Epstein files. She's on the House Oversight Committee. It's a very prominent public committee. She's done a lot of work on that committee. That's what she's running on. They're completely different candidates, and it's truly unclear right now who is going to win that nomination because they're such different candidates, and they're not running like Colin Allred, like Beto O'Rourke. Very, very interesting there.
You touched on this earlier in your answer too, but race is also, you've seen a race when at the event you go to is very different at who's attending which events. How is that going to play out, and could that impact turnout, and what are you seeing from them as opposed to who they're targeting?
Reese, while I was in Texas, a really interesting thing happened. That morning, Jasmine Crockett, I would say last Tuesday of congressional recess, Jasmine Crockett was talking to reporters in a scrum in Dallas. James Tallarico was in Texas just a few hours later. She was hammering him about a super PAC, which, to be clear, James Tallarico does not endorse super PACs. It's a super PAC that has nothing to do with him, that supports his candidacy, calling the ads by the super PAC racist. Hours later, James Tallarico, facing that same group of reporters, I was part of this scrum, having to defend that what that super PAC is doing, and him making clear, I have nothing to do with the super PAC. But it is a huge message that Jasmine Crockett is sending to voters, that she's a Black woman, that she feels that this super PAC that supports James Tallarico is hammering her on that. She accused them of putting a grungy filter on an ad to darken her skin. And James Tallarico put in a really tricky spot as a white man, having to say, basically, I have nothing to do with this super PAC. I mean, it's a representation of what we're seeing right now as a white man who has only really held state office running for election against a woman who has gone viral for being Black, for being someone who's prominent on Capitol Hill. This is just one instance of many that we've seen where this is an issue. And look, Texas is a diverse state. Black and Latino voters are watching these moments. You know, when I talked to different voters in Texas last week, it's really split who supports who. Even polls are showing that it's very split amongst these voters.
This is the political tightrope I feel like that James Tallarico is really walking at the end here. I mean, because it is such a close race, as we all agree, he does need to do some contrast with Crockett, but he is also a white man up against a Black woman in a Democratic primary in 2026. And while maybe identity politics has faded a little bit in the party compared to, say, 2020, 21, it's still very powerful. Crockett understands that. Tallarico understands that. And so he does have to go negative on her, but he also has to be very cognizant of how the different lines of attack could play to those who are attuned to all these racial sensitivities. And as Daniella just pointed out, really the first big, negative salvo against her, which was from the Tallarico super PAC, in some ways you could argue backfired. She instantly called it racist. So I think it was a perfect distillation of what we're talking about.
And you've covered Texas before you here, you had the Texas Tribune for a number of years. I believe you're at the Chronicle as well. What was Tallarico like when covering him? Has he changed at all? Did you always get the sense that, this guy wants to go for higher office? Well, he's served since 2018. So what was covering him and this legislator cover him now?
I met with him when he was thinking of running for State House for the first time. So I've known him for, a good period of time. And that first, State House campaign he ran was really memorable. He was running for a Republican leaning seat. He was making a lot of overtures across the aisle. He was talking about wanting to work with the Republican House Speaker at the time, a guy named Joe Strauss, who, was viewed as an agreeable moderate for most Democrats back then. And so it was a very bipartisan campaign. And, he also showed back then, I think, a knack for generating media attention. At the end of the summer before that general election, he did this thing where he walked across the entire state house district. And that obviously got the attention, at least in the Austin media market. Just these images of him, out in these like wide open roads in the more rural parts of the district, like, sweating through his shirt, like better work, basically. It was just like very I think he's understood, how to captivate voters very early on and generate media attention. So that's something I definitely remember from his early days in politics.
Thank you for that. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to talk about the Republican primary, which is equally, if not more, exciting.
Behind every BP fill-up, thousands of people across America go to work every day. People producing energy offshore, people turning it into products at our refineries, people doing R&D to make products that are better for your engine, people trading and shipping fuels to their destinations, and the people who help you at one of BP's growing family of retail stations. They're part of almost 300,000 jobs we support across the country. Just a few of the ways BP is investing in America.
Welcome back, Daniella. Let's talk about the Republican Senate primary. You were just in Houston reporting on Cornyn and his race against Paxton and Congressman Wesley Hunt. What did you hear on the ground, and how is his team feeling about their chances?
They feel very good about their chances. I was with Wesley Hunt in a town called Nacogdoches, just outside Houston, about 2-hour drive. And he met with a really interesting group of, I would say, Republican women who all found him to be incredibly charming. His primary message, Reese, which I thought was incredibly interesting, is term limits. He said he would only serve in the Senate for 12 years. Now, how often do you actually hear senators commit to that? I don't that often, being here on Capitol Hill every day. He said that he believes that John Cornyn is, a blast from the past of the party. He doesn't represent what the Republican Party is now. And he actually thought the NRSC, which you reported about deeply, should be thanking him. He told me that he is in many ways helping John Cornyn potentially get into a runoff with Ken Paxton because he entered the race, versus it being just maybe versus Ken Paxton or John Cornyn, and hated the attacks that he's had about it being a vanity project because the NRSC has endorsed John Cornyn and has been so furiously fighting for him to win re-election. So a lot of dynamics in Texas that I find very, very interesting when it comes to this primary. I mean, we've got a Black male Republican, John Cornyn, who's been in office for 24 years, and then Ken Paxton, who is a completely different Republican than John Cornyn and has very close ties to President Donald Trump. I mean, you really saw all of these on display when I was driving through Texas, going to all these different campaign events last week when all three of them were on the campaign trail.
Looking at this race, it's hard to imagine. I mean, there's not an incumbent outside probably Bill Cassidy, who voted to impeach Trump in Louisiana, who is in this much danger. I mean, and you never want to be an incumbent down in the polls by as much as Cornyn's down. What does he have to do to ensure that this doesn't end up as a Senator Paxton, or at least the nominee, a GOP nominee Paxton? What does he have to do?
The problem is normally your answer to that question, Reese, would be, well, we're going to spend a lot of money. We're going to spend millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and we're going to basically muscle our way through this primary. The problem is they've already done that. They have spent tens of millions of dollars, he and his allies combined. And if you look at his poll numbers, they just don't seem to have budged very much for all the spending that has been done on his behalf. And this is the point that the Paxton folks will make. He should be in much better position. He should be eyeing 50%, even in a three-way race, as the long-term incumbent in this race, and it simply hasn't happened. And I think the concern, if you're a Cornyn supporter, is there's just a low ceiling on his level of support, that there is a chunk of the Republican electorate in Texas that's decided that he's not conservative enough, that he's not friendly to Trump enough, possibly that he's already been in Congress too long as it is, and they're simply not going to vote for him, whether he faces Ken Paxton or Wesley Hunt in a runoff primary. His ceiling is just going to be below that 50% threshold.
Patrick, I want to ask you, you reported, I don't know how long ago, but a while ago, about Ronnie Jackson potentially wanting to run against Cornyn. Obviously, he is not, but there are talks. It seems as though there's always been talks about people wanting to run against Cornyn in this upcoming election. Where does this stem from, and why is he in so much trouble right now?
Yeah, I just think for years you've seen that, Texas Republicans in public and private polling have just fallen out of love with Cornyn. And so that has presented this issue of a pretty, unpopular incumbent with at least his base heading into a national political environment that, could favor Democrats in the fall. And so you mentioned Ronnie Jackson, for example, but for more than, 2 years now, there's been all these behind the scenes discussions about how to basically solve the quote Cornyn problem. Whether it's Ronnie Jackson or Ken Paxton or Wesley Hunt, they've all sensed an opening to pitch themselves as, the antidote for that problem. I think he is in the sweet spot. It's a question of whether he can make the runoff. Now, he's in the sweet spot in that he can make a credible case that, potentially that he unites the Republican Party better for the primary and could do better in the general election than Ken Paxton. And I think the big dynamic at the end of the primary here is just how much advertising dollars have gone toward targeting Hunt at the end. I think it's very clear that neither Cornyn wants to face Hunt in a runoff, nor Paxton wants to face Hunt in a runoff. Paxton and Cornyn really want to face each other in a runoff because they want to finally duke it out one-on-one. But Cornyn is, I think remains the overall underdog in this nomination fight. And if he goes into a runoff, not as the first place finisher, but as the second place finisher, an incumbent in a runoff in Texas, that is a really tough position to be. You just don't want to be an incumbent in a runoff in Texas. You lose in second place going into a runoff in Texas. You lose a lot of momentum. It's hard to ask for donors to give again, especially in this case, given how much donors have already given to this primary. And so, Cornyn continues to feel like the overall underdog here.
I feel like Cornyn's original sin in this race is that, he's seeking his fifth term in office. He's obviously been a Texas Republican for a long time. And he originates from a different tradition of Republicanism in Texas. He goes back to the George W. Bush and even Rick Perry days where they were open to making deals with Democrats. They were traditionally more welcoming to Hispanic immigrants in particular, really made efforts to win that constituency over in the state. Again, this is something that George W. Bush did in the 90s, right? And Cornyn, I think, really hails from that tradition. More recently, you saw him team up with Democrats to make, some minor changes and background checks when people purchase firearms. That sort of deal-making instinct or that history just isn't where the Republican Party is right now, most rank and file voters. And I think that's what has made him so vulnerable in a way that, as you point out, Reese, everyone was taking a look at, seemingly everybody was taking a look at running against Cornyn this year.
Danielle, I want to come to you for a question about Wesley Hunt. I reported, obviously, that there's a lot of animosity against him within the Texas delegation. People are kind of upset that he's running. People do, to your point, think this is a vanity project. Just in general, where is his standing in this race?
I mean, he's polling a lot better than I think a lot of people expected him to. And I think it also shows that he is a formidable candidate against John Cornyn and Ken Paxton, who, of course, as Patrick noted, and is very accurate and true, would love to have a runoff where they get to duke it out without Wesley Hunt complicating things for them. I think Wesley Hunt added a necessary kind of drama to this Senate primary, considering that, John Cornyn was hoping that it would just be between him and Ken Paxton. And it might not even be between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. I mean, there is a likelihood that it becomes Ken Paxton and Wesley Hunt. I mean, the polling is so close. And I learned a long time ago, Reese, not to completely trust polls because they've been wrong in the past. And he has support. I talked to a lot of voters when I was across Texas last week that found him to be incredibly charming, and his message about term limits to be very interesting. I mean, I think that people are watching what's happening in DC with a aging lawmaking population and thinking maybe it's time for us to elect younger, more diverse people, even for the Republican Party. And that's his message. And he really aligned himself. We haven't really talked about the Trump of it all, but Trump is a huge shadow on what's happening in this Republican primary right now. I mean, you can't really talk about the Republican primary without mentioning that Trump hasn't endorsed any of them, not even the incumbent. There's only two incumbents that Trump hasn't endorsed, and it's Susan Collins and John Cornyn. And Susan Collins would probably benefit from not having an endorsement from Trump, but John Cornyn would. And so, look, Wesley Hunt aligned himself with President Trump very closely, but I heard that from Ken Paxton as well. The first thing he did was talk about how much he agreed with President Trump. And John Cornyn, his stump speech is talking about what he did to execute Trump's agenda. These three Republicans are really more of a test of just what kind of Republican Party is moving forward on Capitol Hill. What do Texas Republican primary voters want? Do they want someone that is very partisan, who is not going to be bipartisan deal maker on Capitol Hill? That's Ken Paxton. Do they want a younger, more diverse Republican on Capitol Hill who is willing to only serve 2 terms? That's Wesley Hunt. Or do they want the incumbent that has served in Congress for 24 years and is continuing to commit to working on bipartisan deals? That's John Cornyn. I mean, it's really, what do Republican primary voters want in Texas?
And I want to touch on the Trump of it all here in a little bit. I want to touch on Ken Paxton as well. Seems as though everybody here agrees that Ken Paxton is going to be in the runoff. It's just a matter of who he faces. Is it going to be Cornyn? Is it going to be Hunt? He's been able to survive a lot of controversy. He was impeached, was not convicted in the Senate. There's been multiple affairs. He's been indicted. And he just seems to come off unscathed. His wife's divorcing him for quote unquote biblical grounds, which we could all read between the lines of what that probably means. How is this race so close? And is it just like the Trump era? Nobody cares? Or how is he able to just kind of this be kind of water off a duck's back?
Yeah, I mean, I remember covering him when he first became Attorney General in 2015, and like about 5 or 6 months into office, he was indicted on state securities fraud charges, and that case stayed with him for close to a decade. Whether it's that case, the federal securities fraud case that he later caught and then beat, or the impeachment trial that you just mentioned, he's always had a good, I think, nose for taking these relatively obscure legal and ethical dilemmas that he finds himself in and translating them to the Republican primary base in a very simplistic and easy to understand way. And so, when he first had the state securities fraud charges, one of the people, involved in that case was someone connected to a rival faction in the Texas legislature at the time. And so he was able to say, these are my old intra-party opponents in the state Senate or the state House who, never wanted me to be Attorney General in the first place. In the impeachment trial, he basically tried, I think I would argue successfully, his lawyers made the case that this was all a conspiracy by the old Bush hands in Texas. They mentioned Karl Rove like a million times during the impeachment trial, even though you could argue Karl Rove probably had a tenuous connection to the impetus for that entire trial. So that's just to say he's always been able to turn these pretty technical legal and ethical issues into broader Republican Party proxy wars, and Republican primary voters have stuck with them as a result. And then having the support of Trump through some of these controversies has also helped shore up his standing with the base. Now, the divorce, I think, is a little different in that at least the divorce and the infidelity as voiced through the messenger of Angela Paxton is a little different in that it is hard to try to turn it into a Republican Party proxy war because she's a member of the state Senate. She's in good standing with conservatives statewide. I think most people, no one would call her a squish. And she is someone who obviously has direct firsthand knowledge. In the past, obviously, he's been able to downplay some allegations because it's, not from a reliable person, either because of their political bias or their proximity to the situation. But, I think she throws all that out the window. And so the divorce and the allegations of infidelity in this moment, I think, are a little different. But as you pointed out, I mean, he seems to be, regardless of those substantive differences to past controversies, he seems to be weathering this latest one as well.
Danielle, I want to come back to you. You mentioned this earlier. Trump has not endorsed yet. How important is it for the candidates to get Trump's endorsement, for Trump to stay out? And how would this change the race if he gets in?
I think the fact that Trump hasn't endorsed is why we're seeing such a close race between the 3 Republicans that are running right now. It's so rare that a president does not endorse an incumbent of their own party for a seat that will really matter to keep the majority in a chamber. And that's what we saw Trump do. He didn't endorse. Pretty early on, it was unclear whether he was going to. We've written a lot at Notice, Alex, a story, Reese, you and I, a story, maybe a couple, about how his influence in this race could have really helped John Cornyn. And because he didn't put his finger on the dial for this race, because he didn't, okay, I should actually clarify, him probably not endorsing did exactly that. He influenced the fact that Ken Paxton now has a shot and Wesley Hunt has a shot to potentially make the runoff. It's incredibly notable and a message that he's sending to Texas that he likes Ken Paxton, that he likes Wesley Hunt, and he doesn't love John Cornyn enough to help him.
Reese, I think you would know this better than I would, too. I mean, there's a lot of private frustration among Republican strategists focused on the Senate that Trump didn't get involved in this race, either to endorse John Cornyn and really put him on a glide path to reelection, or to call John Cornyn into the Oval Office and tell him that, hey, you've had a great career. Just so you know, I'm going to endorse someone else. At which point, I think most people think John Cornyn wouldn't have run for reelection. And the point is, if you had avoided a primary, you also avoid spending tens of millions of dollars in the primary that could otherwise be used for what looks like a pretty competitive general election now for Senate Republicans as they try to hold on to their majority and what could be a tough midterm year for the GOP.
Patrick, I want to end with you on a bigger picture kind of question. Will the results of the Senate primary here have an effect on some of the House races in the state?
Yeah, if you're John Cornyn, you're definitely making that argument. And, we've already heard John Cornyn say that if Ken Paxton is the nominee, that, this new redistricting map that Trump, fought so hard to get passed in Texas, could be in jeopardy, and that these 5 new seats that were drawn for Republicans, some of them could flip blue. And so that is definitely a case that the Cornyn campaign has been making. It is true, just speaking from my own experience, maybe, Paxton as the nominee does win the Senate race, but it's by a smaller margin than a Cornyn would have won the Senate race. And that does have serious down ballot effects. I mean, we saw in 2018 how Ted Cruz hung on in his Senate reelection campaign. I think it was by about 3 percentage points, but down ballot, Democrats made some of their best progress in Texas in recent memory. They picked up 2 U.S. House seats. They picked up a dozen state legislative seats. And so, there's very recent history to suggest that if there's a competitive Senate race at the top of the ticket in Texas in November, it can have serious down ballot effects.
We are going to end it there. Alex, Daniella, Patrick, thank you all so much for joining. I greatly appreciate it, and we'll see you all around.
Thanks, Reese.
Thank you, Reese.
Thanks for having me.
On Notice is a production of Notice, and it's hosted by me, Reese Gorman. This show is produced by Notice and the team at the Podglomerate. Special thanks to Kate Nocera and Justin Pellegrini. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You could send us a note at podcast@notus.com. And if you like this episode, leave us a good review on Apple Podcasts. See you next week.
Behind the delivery trucks that keep your life stocked, thousands of employees at BP go to work every day. People bringing a new offshore production platform online. People making our refineries capable of more, like making renewable diesel from agricultural waste. People trading and shipping fuels to our customers. And people helping truckers fill up and get maintenance at our convenient locations. They're part of almost 300,000 jobs we support across the country. Just a few of the ways BP is investing in America.